Hello, everybody. For today's presentation, I want to look at a letter from the Grand Master, or the leader of this Knights Hospitaller Order, to Cardinal Ignazio Boncompagni from the late 18th century. Now, let's get to the sum and substance of what this letter actually says. First of all, it's thanking the Cardinal for his help in resolving a conflict in the Toulouse Priory. Get into all that later. And second, as part of that, he's also thanking the cardinal by offering the cardinal's nephew knighthood within this order. And he says he attaches a small cross. Here's an illustration, albeit 200 years prior to when this letter was written, maybe more, of what the cross may have looked like. What is the Order of St. John, or the Knights Hospitaller? Well, it's a Catholic religious and military order, all which ultimately answer to the Pope, but I think we're going to complicate that a little later. It has Crusade roots. It was born of the monastic tradition. In fact, there's a linguistic connection between the hospitaller and the word hospital, right? But it was militarized during the Crusades under papal charter. And I think we can skip a lot of that history to go to 1530, which is when Pope Clement VII and the Holy Roman Emperor, as well as King of Sicily, something important for later, Charles V, they came to a deal where Charles granted the Knights of Malta, he granted them Malta, the island, as a fief, basically as their center. But beyond Malta, they held sort of territories throughout Europe, divided into langs, administrative divisions. And these were basically priories, which were the religious centers, and commanderies, which were more of the political military centers. And of course, they're actually led by a Grand Master from 1775 when he was elected to 1797 when he died. That was Emmanuel de Rohan Polduc. By the way, I'm probably butchering his name, and every French word in this, the letter is written in French, so bear with me on that. Okay. Yeah, here's a map of Europe. At around the time it was written, we can see Malta, this little island down here. That's where Grand Master Rohan is. The Papal States, of course, where the Vatican and the Cardinal are. And roughly around here is where the Toulouse Priory is. Okay, Grand Master Rohan himself. Born in Spain, actually, but of a French noble family. In fact, the French priory celebrated when he was elected because he was the first Frenchman to be elected to the position in like 100 years. But a kind of rough start for a noble. His father was expelled from the country, and so he didn't really inherit all of those other positions and wealth that came with his father because of that conflict with France. His father was basically accused of treason. So he joined the order, and he basically ended up rising in the ranks until he led it. As leader of the order, he's usually known as a reformer. He wrote Maltese legal code, and within the order itself, created a new lang, the Anglo-Bavarian. And as you might expect for someone that's politically connected, very diplomatically involved throughout Europe and even America. Not a lot of time to get into that, but he did keep a correspondence with Benjamin Franklin, for example. Okay, so right away, who actually controls it, right? The order. The easy answer is, of course, Rohan, but he's technically answering to the Pope, as this is a Catholic order. And simultaneously, the land he's on, Malta, was given as a fief to the order by the King of Naples. So King Ferdinand, pictured here, also has a say in this. And it seems that the general policy of the Grand Masters of this century is really to try to play these authorities off of each other. Okay. And we can see here that already there's some kind of complicated questions if we look at the Toulouse Priory specifically as to who's controlling it. Because we have Grandmaster Rohan, but we also have the Pope, right? Can the Pope directly control the priory, or is it solely Rohan's jurisdiction? That's going to be basically the problem, which is referenced in the letter. And further complicating that, we have the King of France, because the priory is located in France. So that's Louis XVI, soon to be beheaded in the Revolution, right? Right on the eve of the French Revolution is when this letter was written, 2 years off. And we'll see him kind of pop up in the archives as maybe another threat to Rohan's sovereignty. So what is the Priory of Toulouse? Well, I already said that this was basically a religious center of the order, right? But it wasn't just a church, let's say. It was very actually wealthy and powerful. And this is largely because of in France, and this is how what kind of leads to the revolution, right? You had a lot of aristocratic and ecclesiastical privileges, specifically on things like tax exemptions. And of course, it's also a sovereign order. So is it technically like part of France and can it be taxed like that? Complicated questions. And some of that's addressed, as you can see, in 1779, when the French state is certainly in some sort of financial crisis. They start coming after the Grand Prior, mentioned in the letter, of his property, saying that anything in his property and around it can be taxed. And of course, he says no, it can't. One of Rohan's first acts was to institute a tax against the Priory of Toulouse. He's a big reformer, as I said, and he needs money for it. And the Priory of Toulouse seems like a great place because of how wealthy they are. Yeah, you have previous grandmasters trying to decentralize all that wealth and power from them, detaching the commanderies from it throughout this century. Oh yeah, and in the sovereignty question, there's even debate held within this priory when the estates general are eventually called as to do we as members of this order even send representatives to the estates general? I think they ultimately decided on no, but there's that question of whose control are they really under, right? So we see that really what's happening here, what this conflict is over, is Rohan's taking money from the treasury of Toulouse to fund those other endeavors. And here are the archives of Haute Garonne, which really lists all this out, not the original documents, but summaries of them, which are quite useful. So a lot of that money, as far as I can tell, seems to be going to the officials of that newly formed Anglo-Bavarian League. By the way, the Priory of Toulouse doesn't even think that legally it should exist. Um, Not insignificant amounts, I'd say. So you have here pictured the bailiff of Flaxlanden, made Grand Prior of that new Lang, right? That whole division, Anglo-Bavaria, he controls it. And he was given, again, it's sort of hard to draw financial comparisons across different eras of history like this, but it seems like maybe $10,000. I'm sorry, 96,000, almost $100,000 in this time. And how much money that is that a lot or a little for his position? I guess that can all be disputed, but it is interesting that this one man is, I guess, collecting that much money out of France, right? When the French Revolution is 2 years away. I think it's a great demonstration of these sort of privileges that people ended up revolting against. Okay, more on this. Also accused of having unjustly taken funds by the priory was Sagramosa, who's reported in the letter, right? He's the one who says to Rohan that this cardinal guy is doing a good job of resolving it. Also extremely well connected, diplomat, characterized also as being part of the Enlightenment, right? Corresponds with all these leading scientific figures. And moving on. So we have this question of authority, right? We have all these people involved in these complicated issues of sovereignty. And I think where Cardinal Boncompagnie comes in is that he sort of acts as the intermediary between the Pope and the Toulouse Priory, right? And in doing so, pretty much ends this problem of the pension funds. So just a little bit on Boncompagnie. He made cardinal in 1775, coincidentally, the same year that the Grand Master gets to his position. He's also depicted as this very administratively and diplomatically powerful guy. And in fact, he's made papal secretary of state, an extremely important diplomatic position in 1785. So he's said to basically, he's there on behalf of the Pope to try to resolve this issue because it's spiraling out of control in Toulouse. And this is not something, at least initially from the archives, that it seems like Rohan likes because, of course, he wants to be sovereign and in control of his own order, and then the Pope sends someone to resolve what are really internal disputes. And yeah, so this appeal to him is in fact a major issue for the priory and apparently for Rohan too. Although in his letter he's all defensive and says that he did everything according to precedence. We'll get into all that. And again, there's even the French king involved because he's threatening that he's going to take measures to bring the knights back to duties if the Grand Master only says the word. What those measures are, no clue, but it's an added pressure to bring this issue to a conclusion. So both sides of this issue are apparently very satisfied with what the cardinal is doing in Toulouse. And we see the Grand Prior, the late Grand Prior at the time the letter's written, he died that same month that the letter was written, saying that he was very grateful for Bone Company's work as well. He even mentions the same complaint that comes up in our letter from the archives, right? Incendiary, arsonist. Not sure exactly what that refers to, but clearly thinks we're getting a little heated. Rohan says that he never even said that. And more connections to the letter from these archives is that we can see that Rohan is very adamant in his letter to Bone Company saying, I did everything according to precedent, right? And Toulouse is pretty adamant that Rohan was actually violating not just precedent, but his own precedent completely in saying that they could not appeal directly to the Holy See. Okay. So as said, Lamont would pass, who's the Grand Prior Lamont of the Toulouse Priory, would pass away very shortly after. Apparently, this is the gist of the deal that they struck. So the pensions taken already, those are fine. But the Pope would promise to have some more caution in approving future ones. So in a sense, it's a win for the Pope, at least nominally, because he gets some more authority on this matter. There's also this question of marginal notes, no more of that. I think that could be referring to what was written in terms of the complaints, but I'm not totally sure. All right, so moving on to the second part of this, we have the offer of knighthood. Offered to a young nephew of the cardinal. Now, I'm not really sure who that is. He had a lot of brothers and, a lot of children. I think the most reasonable guess for what I could gather would be Luigi the First, but no record of him having ever accepted it, if that even is the case. But anyway, so he's offering gratitude. Okay, so of course the knighthood is, saying thanks. But it's also, I think, more politically significant than that because, it's a way to handle this very delicate situation of who has control over the order and its internal affairs, trying not to upset the papacy, probably, maybe resolving some of those disputes that emerged before. And it also fortifies a pretty nice connection between the Grand Master of the Order and one of the Vatican's most powerful politicians, right? That of course, being the Cardinal. But I think there might be something even more to it than that, more to, this being a way to get the nephew of the Vatican Secretary of State in your order. I think it also might have some broader geopolitical significance. This is because Ignazio, the cardinal, was the brother of Antonio II Bone Company, who, and by the way, the cardinal is even referred to as the Prince of Piombino in the letter. He is not, technically, that is a title that goes to Antonio II, but obviously the Grand Master is well aware of the political power this family has, in addition to ecclesiastical. He ends up getting ousted following Napoleonic invasion. This letter is interesting because it's really on the verge of the end of an era that the French Revolution brings about. All these positions of these nobles are basically to be abolished, everyone mentioned. Anyway, the Prince of Piombino was technically a vassal of the King of Naples, who we remember also claims vassalage over Malta itself. The Prince of Piombino at this time, being Antonio II, is not really that keen on Ferdinand's power either. So now we have a moment where someone connected not just to the Vatican, but to this struggle with the Kingdom of Naples is being basically brought into the order and, under Rohan's control to a degree, but certainly at least a stronger connection. So we have this disputed claim of sovereignty with the King of Sicily and Naples over the Grand Master Rohan. This is a chart from before, but I think we can complicate this by bringing up something like this, right? So all of a sudden you have this more complicated web of noble connections, which I think this letter is really all about. This nephew sort of becomes at the center of both this issue with sovereignty regarding the Catholic Church, but also with the more politically sided things, the state side of things, right, with the King of Naples. And here is a more complicated version of this, extending to all the figures in the letter. I'm not really going to go over this, but if anyone wants to look back at this to see what that's like, here that is. Okay, and just to wrap things up, we have the end of the order in Malta really shortly after this letter is written, right? 1787 is written. 1789, as mentioned, the revolution begins. The revolutionary government kicks out the order from France, seizes all its assets and properties, and that same year, Rohan suffers a stroke. So definitely a year of decline for them in 1792. He passes away in 1797. In 1798, less than a year after, Napoleon is invading Malta. Again, think of its enormous wealth as well as its very strategic positioning, and expels the order from the island. And I think that should pretty much wrap everything up. So in general, while this may be a minor offer of knighthood, I think it does touch on a lot of big questions of politics and the division between church and state at this time, as well as the broader geopolitics of all these kingdoms and questions of sovereignty, really dating from feudal arrangements before the more modern era of the nation state that the French Revolution brings on.